On government, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Maria Popova and Professor Mark Brawley from political science. And on opposition, we have Professor John Sosky and Professor Jason Ogle from history. The topic of the debate motion is "This House Supports American Interventionism Abroad." Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Mark Brawley from political science to open this debate today. Here.
The very first point I wanted to make concerns that last word, interventionism. Technically, that covers the gamut of tools that a state can use to try to intervene or deal with problems inside other states, and therefore it would be a very long debate to talk about all the different tools, but also a really easy one for us to win. So, what I'd like to do is limit the discussion here to military intervention abroad. That clearly is what we need to talk about, and that will give my colleagues on this side a sporting chance. It's merely polite. Even if we talk about military intervention abroad by the United States, I think the logic here is obvious that we should support it. If they want to talk about whether it's practical or not, I invite them to do so. That involves reviewing lots of different cases. That's not how I'm going to spend my 7 minutes. If they're foolish enough to do that, go ahead. What I would like to do is talk about the principle of interventionism here for the United States, for all countries, and talk about interventionism and, on the other hand, non-interventionism. That's the choice that sits before us. And I think a lot of the confusion here, which I expect to hear from my colleagues, draws from the notion of interventionism versus sovereignty. Sovereignty is a claim that political entities make that they are the highest political authority, that they will not respect any higher political authority than themselves. That tends to be the concept underlying arguments that are against intervention.
And this is the moment to pose the utopian question: how can this be done better? How can this be done differently? So that we are not continuously heirs of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, that we are not continuously heirs of the financial crisis, probably the most important U.S. external intervention of our generation, and we're not continuously heirs of drone strikes in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But also that we're not heirs of a new international hegemonic order where China is the main player. And to seriously confront that reality, and to seriously ask the question, actually, how can one build a democratic, accountable global order, is the challenge of our intellectual moment. And that's why I am defending opposition to U.S. intervention, because it is a utopian commitment to keep that question alive.
The murder of significant numbers of people was prevented through military intervention in Kosovo in 1999. And I would challenge our opponents from the opposition to speak to the surviving family members of victims of the Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia, which is an event that is actually, we marked 20 years of it.
The victims of U.S. military intervention were unable, because of U.S. isolationism in the other side, to get into the United States. What the opposition calls for is not isolationism, is not even sovereignty, nor is it some idea of an 18th century past that we're referring to or that we're hoping for, or even a utopian dream that we're clamoring. It is rather an internationally engaged republic that respects the rule of law, that listens to the traditions of American statesmen, of American farmers, of American workers, of the better and best elements of American history, not of its worst. And we submit that the opposite, or the choice before us, is not between interventionism and sovereignty. It's between U.S. military interventionism and a law-abiding, just republic.
Hi, this is Matthew Tasher from the Political Beyond, and I'm here with Professor Mark Brawley. Today you just did a debate on American interventionism alongside your fellow professor, Mrs. Maria Popova. So could you maybe resume your stance on American interventionism?
Well, I tried to make 3 essential points in favor of American interventionism, and more specifically military intervention, on principle. So not debating specific examples, but on principle. And the very first one was that sovereignty is not this sort of cherished, hallowed point in international law that can never be violated. So sometimes military interventions are allowed under international law based on a state not being able to uphold its own effective sovereignty. So failed or failing states offer one opportunity for military intervention. The second point had to do with the evolving notions of sovereignty, and that sovereignty is contingent on other things, and that, in fact, now states may, under certain circumstances, be required to intervene in others to stop something such as a genocide occurring. And then the third point was simply that all states have interests that spill over into other areas, problems in one state spill over into another, and therefore military interventions are sometimes required simply to pursue a state's interests. And the United States is no different than any other country.
And your opponents brought up a few fallacies that we often would see when we talk about interventionism, such as counting deaths before they actually occur. Now, do you think this is something that we have to do? That the United States, when it looks at a certain area of the world, it has to make calculations and see if it's worth intervening, or whether they should sit back and just become isolationists as they have been in the past?
Well, in fact, this highlights one of the key differences between history and political science. Historians, by nature and by training, I think are loath to think about prospecting into the future, whereas that's an essential part of what we do in political science. We develop arguments, theories, models, precisely because we're interested in influencing the future. That's what policy is about. And therefore, you can't just make policy decisions on whether to intervene or not on faith or on other grounds. You need to think about the consequences. And so we try to develop the tools. We're not perfect. Policy decisions, including most definitely policy decisions by the American government, aren't perfect either. And therefore, it's easy to find examples where imprudent decisions were made or mistakes occurred. And there's no doubt about that. And the opposition raised some of those examples. But for every one of those, I would argue that you can also find examples where military intervention on the part of the United States was effective, and effective in terms of making the conditions better on the ground for the people who live there, saving lives, stopping things that otherwise would have gone on that were bad.
Okay. And they also spoke of maybe not eliminating intervention totally, but just military intervention. What would be your rebuttal to that statement? Because I know you didn't have a chance to really go against that.
We actually chose to make the debate much more specifically about military intervention, to make it a more difficult and challenging task on our part. Because clearly military intervention is one tool amongst many. There are lots of different ways states can go about influencing other countries, and certainly those forms of engagement are important and are useful. They can also be used for evil purposes, right? You can kill a lot of people through some kinds of economic policies and other measures almost as effectively as using military force. So there's good and bad associated with those kinds of policies and techniques. The motion that we were asked to debate was not sort of which will you use rather than some other. This gets down again to sort of a case-by-case basis. And often, and the example of failed states, I think, is a perfect one. Action by the international community to go in on the ground and establish order is almost always necessary before you can talk about doing anything else. You can't go in and deliver aid, you can't go in and do reconstruction after some catastrophic event if there's no security on the ground. And that means intervening. Same story if you're looking on and observing genocide starting in some place. You have to actually be on the ground intervening to make things work at that moment. And if the United States was prohibited from being in those interventions, if we say the US should never do this, you're basically also saying the West will not be able to do this. The international community, even more broadly than the West, will not be able to intervene because the US is the one military power that has that capacity. in terms of logistical support, troops, the broad spectrum of military forces that's required to be effective. And even then, its abilities are incredibly limited, right? We're talking about the practicality of interventions in places like Syria now, and intervening in those sorts of states of a middle range, like Iraq, incredibly taxing, incredibly difficult, and incredibly dangerous for the U.S. soldiers themselves.
And to control the United States, they brought up the point that institutions have failed to control unilateral action by the United States, as we saw in Iraq. What would you say against that to protect, I guess, from the United States going wherever it wants on an ad hoc basis? Although they would not do such actions, the possibility remains that they could go wherever they feel is necessary for themselves to go.
There are two answers I'd have for addressing those concerns. And the very first one is the United States is a democracy. And American statesmen will make decisions that represent their constituents. They are responsible to their constituents first and foremost, and they are going to be controlled and limited in what they do on that basis, first and foremost. Secondly, and what our opponents brought up, was the notion that we need better rules and better means of governance. They set this in code words, such as utopia, etc. But I'm quite familiar with those arguments, and I think I even said in the debate that may be the debate we should be having on practical grounds. How do you develop better institutions at the international level that control what states do and guide what states do? Now, the drawback to that has always been, and it's been true for a century now, that you may have those desires to create some better governance structures, but it's very hard to get consensus, it's very hard to figure out ways to make that work. And if anything, the future does not bode well on this, because some of the more powerful states in the system, and certainly ones that are rising in power, such as China in particular, are not big fans of these evolving notions of sovereignty. They are much more likely to push for turning the clock back and making it so that governments can do what they want against their own citizens. Now, that may restrict American intervention much more effectively in the future. Does that mean the world will be a better place? I think not.
And we just talked about this earlier. Do you think it'd be possible to see an isolationist United States emerge in the future where military intervention would no longer occur because of China?
I wouldn't say because of China. Certainly, there are always issues that make it difficult for a state, even if it has the desire to intervene, to actually carry that out. If you look, and people often look at this and note the hypocrisy involved in this, that you intervene in some situations and save some people but not others. It's much easier to intervene if you know you can be effective, if you can bring overwhelming force to bear. So areas that are closer to where there's a large military infrastructure, so the former Yugoslavia, North Africa, places where American military power can be wielded much more effectively, those are places where intervention's going to be much more practical. Intervening in the middle of Africa, where Rwanda is located, incredibly not practical. Very difficult to make that effective, and therefore not likely to happen. China's not likely to act as a restraint, I think, on American intervention in some broader sense, except to make it so that the UN, at least the UN Security Council, won't sanction those effects. I think the longer term problems that we see, though, is that the US, as long as its economy is slow and the budget is out of whack, that will also act as constraints. So they're really problems that are much more internal and homemade problems, but they will constrain how active the United States can be in any form, military or not, at the international level for the coming decade or so. And then we'll have to wait and see.
That's perfect. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So if there's anything else you'd like to say?
No, thank you for the invitation, and it was a good debate. It was fun.
Yeah, it was very fun. Thank you very much. This is Matthew signing off from the Political Beyond.